So, believe it or not, I was asked to give another teaching, this time on an essay called Uji, which is usually translated as the time being. And this essay is one fascicle in a much larger work known as the Kana Shobogenzo, or the Treasury of the True Dharma Eye. And Uji, or the time being, was written by the 13th century Zen master Eihei Dogen. It was composed in 1240, the year 1240. And it's famous for being one of the most difficult to interpret pieces of writing by Master Dogen. And it's difficult for multiple reasons. One reason is that it's psychologically quite profound. Another reason is that it's very difficult to translate. And one of the reasons that it's difficult to translate is because it is psychologically profound. And so one has to have a very intimate understanding, spiritual understanding of the work to even begin to be able to translate it. Another factor, however, is that as well as being a master of Zen, Dogen Zenji was also a great master of language and uses plays on words and puns and has multiple meanings quite intentionally in his work. And so that makes the job of moving his meaning from one language to another extremely challenging. Although those plays on words exist right there in the title of Uji, or the time being, we have this expression in English: for the time being, I'm going to sit here. For the time being, I'm going to talk. And Dogen Zenji does mean it that way, but he also means time being as a hyphenated single term, a being that is time itself. And also that time is being. And so while both things, or maybe we could say even all three things, are going on at the same time in this essay, we have quite a bit of work ahead of us in order to understand it. Now, in a shorter and somewhat informal talk like the one I'm about to give, there's no way that I can treat every section of the essay. And so I'm going to be picking and choosing here and there. I want to say that if you do read the essay on your own and you try to practice with it, that it's very important not to view it as a philosophical work. It really isn't philosophy. Philosophy, in the words of Yasutani Roshi, is the study of foolishness, kind of a harsh judgment, but also bears some truth. And it's also appropriate not to read Uji as an example of Buddhist metaphysics or something like that. No, Uji is a spiritual teaching, and it has to be read in that light. And so it has to be practiced with, as opposed to merely intellectually grasped, although the intellect has to play a role as well. The other thing I would urge is that if you are reading Uji on your own, to beware. Uji, if you really take it very seriously, has to be treated with some great respect and care. And you also have to have a fairly courageous heart to enter into it. And the reason I say that is because if you take seriously what Dogen Zenji has to say about the time being, it may cast a very, very brilliant light into the midst of your life. And that light may reveal some things that you may not be ready to accept. And I'll touch on that just a little bit today. But I think it is worth bearing in mind that sometimes works like this and certain other cultural artifacts in the Buddhist tradition that we use for teaching purposes are intended for the initiated, or they are intended for those who are working closely with the teacher. Because if you take these things on without any guidance, without the appropriate context, it can be psychologically destabilizing. I don't mean to suggest that it's going to cause insanity or madness, something like that, just that it can produce a kind of existential crisis that may not be particularly helpful for you. So just some thoughts. And then, of course, read slowly, read carefully. Now, everyone acknowledges that this essay is very difficult to interpret. But I will say this, that Dogen's first sentence, the very first sentence of his in the essay, really gets to the heart of the matter. And it is as follows. For the time being, here means time itself is being. And all being is time. Again, for the time being, here means time itself is being. And all being is time. And then he continues, a golden 16-foot body is time. Because it is time, there is the radiant illumination of time. Now, the 16-foot golden body is an epithet for the Buddha. He was purportedly 16 feet tall, and also had a kind of golden radiance about his being, an aura, if you will. And then Dogen writes about doubt as it pertains to time and existence. Here's what he has to say. Even though you do not measure the hours of the day as long or short, far or near, you still call it 12 hours. Because the signs of time's coming and going are obvious, people do not doubt it. Although they do not doubt it, they do not understand it. Or when sentient beings doubt what they do not understand, their doubt is not firmly fixed. Because of that, their past doubts do not necessarily coincide with the present doubt. Yet doubt itself is nothing but time. So I want to go through that little section line by line. So again, even though you do not measure the hours of the day as long or short, far or near, you still call it 12 hours. So in East Asian culture at the time Dogen was writing, in the 13th century, a whole day-night period, which we divide into 24 hours, was then divided into 12. So he's really talking about time in general, okay? So he says, even though you do not measure the hours as long or short or far or near, you still call it the 12 hours, or you still call it time. And the point here is that we use words, we use language, and have to, must use words and language to communicate. But the problem is, even though language is very efficient and it does, for example, help us perpetuate the Buddha Dharma, it also is inherently limited. And that means that we may say, well, that was a day, or that was a night. Well, that was 24 hours. Well, this was a week, a month, a year, a lifetime. This is time. As soon as we apply these kinds of labels, we tend not to look into it any further. So if we allow language to be a substitute for experiential insight, then we're likely going to miss something. So we call it time, even though we haven't really examined it. And he says, because the signs of time's coming and going are obvious, people do not doubt it. Yes, it is obvious. Often when I'm speaking about the Buddha's teaching, I say it was premised on the law of impermanence, that things change, all things change, that nothing at all lasts. And of course, everyone agrees. You know, you just look around you and you can see that everything is not going to last. The candle on the altar, the incense, they burn, they will not last. Trees do not last. Houses do not last. Ultimately, my life will not last. And then he writes, although they do not doubt it, they do not understand it. And this is an incredibly important point, because what's implied here is that we are unaware of the true nature of time because we don't have a reason to doubt it. We trust language that much. We trust our conceptual understanding of the world so much, our conditioned response to the world so much, that there is no room for doubt. And doubt, you know, is uncomfortable, and so we tend to want to dismiss it. But I will tell you this, if you read Uji with care and respect, it will cast doubt into your mind about the true nature of time and existence. But we need that doubt. We need it because without it, we will have no reason to question its true nature. And if we do not question the true nature of time, then we will have no real way of understanding what this life is all about. Now, in other contexts, we talk about the 3 pillars of Zen, and there is a very famous book by that title. So the 3 pillars of Zen are faith, doubt, and practice. So faith is the reasoned faith that the Buddha's teaching is good and true. We tend to have an instinctive positive response to, say, the 4 Noble Truths, even though we may not really fully be able to realize those truths in our lives when we're first starting out on the path, or maybe many years later. So, but we have this faith, okay? And that might be enough, you know, we could just stop, be done, okay, I believe it, but that's not enough. We have to have the same awakening experience that Shakyamuni Buddha had to verify that faith is actually a reflection of the truth, of our true nature. But we have a problem, and the problem is doubt. And here I'm not talking about mere skepticism, but rather what Yasutani Roshi would call a doubt mass, that this seeming incapacity to realize that each and every one of us has Buddha nature. And so we have to resolve the conflict or the dissonance that arises as a result of our faith in the Buddha's teaching and our doubt that it's true for ourselves. And the way we resolve that conflict is through practice. Thus, the three pillars are faith, doubt, and practice. Now, Master Dogen writes in this section, or when sentient beings doubt what they do not understand, their doubt is not firmly fixed. And this also is a very important idea, because what it means is that, well, the implication is that because it's not fixed, it changes over time. And so there are these comings and goings of doubt in various contexts. And as a result of the coming and going of these various doubts about things as they arise and fall away, we don't really see that there is an undercurrent that is common to all of those momentary or temporary experiences of doubt and uncertainty and confusion. So we have to really dig deep in order to see through these arisings of doubt. So when we do that, when we finally make the decision to try hard to rid ourselves of our existential uncertainty, our doubt, we are taking responsibility. It's very important that we understand that that responsibility is something much bigger and at a different level than what we ordinarily think of as our responsibility. Ordinarily, we think of our responsibilities as having to do with particular duties in our lives. So I am responsible for some things and other people are responsible for some other things. But the kind of responsibility that I'm talking about here is responsibility for everything. There is no limit to your responsibility. And I do mean your personal responsibility. Now that might be a burden you're unwilling to accept. But before you dismiss the idea that you are responsible for all things, that you are responsible for the entire earth, look deeply into what Dogen Zenji has to say about the time being. Now, a little later in the essay, he explains why it is we dislike this idea of having to take responsibility, or even just of having to dive completely into practice and to devote ourselves to it thoroughly. What he says is this. He says, do not think that time merely flies away or that time merely passes. Do not see flying away as the only function of time. If time merely flies away, you would be separated from time. And he also writes, you may suppose that time is only passing away and not understand that time never arrives. This idea that one could be separated from time is an interesting one. We're actually really not separated from time, but we do rather unconsciously imagine that that is the case. So let me see if I can provide some context for what Master Dogen is saying. Let's think about the evidence of time's passing. It's all around us. Things change, and by implication, there are future moments of time, and there are past moments of time. We therefore believe that time only just passes. And because we think this is so, we conclude that we live within the present moment, sandwiched between the past and the future. Thus, we think we are separated from the future, separated from the past. It's like we're living on this little island called the present, or called the time being. This gap, or this separation, is imaginary. And unfortunately, it makes a perfect excuse for delaying our complete dedication to our practice, because it allows us to argue that certain conditions must first arise before we can get serious about things. Those conditions, of course, are just imaginary, like I said. They're just moments that we think are somewhere in potential in the future and that they will eventually arrive. But this is like imagining that you are living in two realities. There is the reality of the present, in which you are sentient and aware of yourself, or you think you are. And there is this other reality that you firmly believe exists, the reality of a future that is supposed to arrive. But there is no room for two realities in reality. There's only one reality. And it would be like, as we say in Zen, putting a head on top of your head. Who needs a second head? It would be very confusing, one head to live in the present moment and another head to imagine living a different life, which is what most of us do most of the time. How confusing that would be. And really, it creates a great deal of suffering for ourselves and others. So we may tell ourselves that we want to practice very hard. We want to become Buddhas, for example, that we want to know all that there is to know about who we are or what is the nature of our existence. We want to be able to live like a Buddha, to live without moral imperfections, to have the most perfectly completed understanding of reality, and perhaps to help others along the Buddha's path. But then you look around at the circumstances of your actual life and you see the awful truth of your constant mistakes, of your fears, of your anxieties, of your spiritual blindnesses, your doubts, your lack of faith, and your lack of practice. And you realize being a Buddha seems utterly out of the question. No, it's impossible. I can't do it. You can't shoulder the responsibility of being a perfect Buddha. Not yet. Not until the right conditions arrive in the present moment. Then you'll be willing to be a Buddha. But there's a problem with this kind of thinking, and Dogen explains it this way. He says, you may suppose that time is only passing away, and that's what creates the gap. It makes us think we're separate and out of time. He says, you may think time is only passing away and not understand that time never arrives. Time never arrives. You could spend the rest of your life contemplating just that single sentence. Time never arrives. And that's why the conditions that we hope may come to us and allow us to be that perfectly clear Buddha never show up. It's just not in the nature of time to arrive. When you realize this, then the gap disappears. You are not sandwiched between the past and the future. You are not out of time. And you will realize, too, that all that time that you were attempting to escape, being yourself, this 16-foot golden body, that all that time that went by, you were already splendidly illuminating all time. You were always responsible for the whole world. But if and when you attain this understanding, you should also know that that understanding does not depend on time's arriving. If that were true, if time could arrive, then there would be no time. It would cease to flow. And awakening would become impossible. In fact, there would be nothing at all. No forms, no ideas, no things, no reality. Just nothing. But that's not how it is. Time being is the sole reality. Master tells us that though time flows, it nevertheless abides within its own situation. He says the time being has the quality of flowing. So-called today flows into tomorrow. Today flows into yesterday. Yesterday flows into today. And today flows into today. Tomorrow flows into tomorrow. He says, do not think flowing is like the wind and rain moving from west to east. The entire world is not unchangeable, is not immovable. It flows. Flowing is like spring. Spring, with all its numerous aspects, is called flowing. When spring flows, there is nothing outside of spring. Study this in detail. Spring invariably flows through spring. Although flowing itself is not spring, flowing occurs throughout spring. Thus, flowing is completed at just this moment of spring. It's surely some of my favorite lines in this essay. To understand spring flows through spring, you must look deeply into your own life and see that the body and mind as you currently perceive them are delusions born of believing that time will arrive, that someday your ship will come in, that someday the whole world is going to be your oyster. The important thing is to see that there is no ship to come in. You have everything that you imagined the ship would bring you. Outside in the front yard, our new service-berried tree is in full bloom. You may think you know how it will be when the flowers fall, but how can you know that if you cannot know the arriving and the non-arriving of spring flowing through spring? Seeing the white petals clearly here and now is already the great matter of life and death. It is already standing in the line of Buddhas and ancestor teachers. The only question is whether you will agree to allow the 8 arms, the 3 faces of the Bodhisattva of compassion to reach out and touch you and realize you are the time being. So if you want to make comments about this talk or ask questions about it, please add your comments at the bottom of the post, or you can do it on the YouTube site, either one. Thank you very much for listening.